Well, Mark Carney gets sworn in tomorrow, and CBC News has confirmed that his first trip as Prime Minister will be to London and then Paris. Carney is expected to travel there next week to connect with foreign leaders. But this week, foreign ministers from G7 countries are gathered for a two-day summit in Quebec. On the table for discussion, Russia's war in Ukraine and the ongoing unrest in the Middle East. Also top of mind, U.S. President Trump's tariff and annexation threats. However, Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly made no mention of either of those during her opening address.
I think that here as G7 foreign minister, we must meet the moment, and it is up to us to do that task. And we should not be daunted by the task. I think we should be working together.
The CBC's Kate McKenna is at the summit in Quebec, and she joins us now. Kate, no joint statement yet. Not much news coming out of there at this point in time. Are there takeaways for the summit as you and I are speaking here 20 after 6?
Well, that's a tough way to start it, David. But to your point, we have not received very many details about what the meetings were like. Today, we're hoping to hear from Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly, perhaps sometime tonight, perhaps tomorrow, about what went on behind these closed-door meetings. Now, as you pointed out, the focus of these meetings on paper were about some of the largest conflicts in the world, such as the war in Ukraine, the situation in the Middle East, what's happening in China. But we also know that Mélanie Joly set the stage yesterday by saying that she plans to bring up tariffs in every bilateral meeting that she has with other G7 foreign ministers. And today we know she met with Marco Rubio at 8 o'clock this morning. She said she was going to bring up tariffs with him. We know that she has a relationship, an ongoing relationship with Marco Rubio. It's something she speaks about publicly often. What is interesting is whether or not she brought up the subject of Donald Trump's proposed annexation of Canada to make it another state in the United States. We're hearing that probably tariffs was the focus of that conversation, but there have been signs of solidarity here from Canada's other allies, including Germany and the foreign representative or the foreign ministry representative of the EU, who wore red and white today. And the EU representative actually did an interview with CNN wearing a red outfit with a maple leaf pin, sending a clear message, and even saying to the journalist that she was wearing that in solidarity with Canada. So tariffs top of mind. Donald Trump threatened that 200% tariff on European wine today. That's something that's being discussed in the corridors here, as well as this annexation threat of Canada. But what actually happened in these meetings, we don't know. It's not clear when we're going to know. And of course, there's a very large looming event in Canada tomorrow, which is the swearing in of a new prime minister.
Yes, I would imagine that is preoccupying Mélanie Joly's time too, right? But you're right. The show of solidarity from Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, who is a pretty close friend of Mélanie Joly's, as I understand it, and Kaja Kallas, the former prime minister of Estonia, a Baltic nation, understanding the problems of having neighbors that are maybe difficult to deal with at times. But let's just look ahead. We've got this swearing in tomorrow. We're all reporting Mélanie Joly is staying on as foreign affairs minister. Normally, she wouldn't have to be at the shuffle, but because the ministry is dissolving when Justin Trudeau quits, she's got to be here, but also she's got to be there. So how do these two events intersect? Because she needs to take the oath again.
Well, that's kind of the million-dollar question, and it's a question a lot of reporters have been asking themselves here, because we know the swearing in is at 11, but the end of this event was planned for after that, in which case she would not technically be the foreign minister anymore, unless there's some loophole that I don't know about and no one here seems to know about. And another thing that's maybe worth highlighting is that there's often a blackout, a media blackout, an unofficial kind of edict to tell people not to make news on days when there is big news. Including, sorry, I think some of our colleagues are having fun over there, on days where there is big news happening, that people are told not to make additional news. And so These are all questions we're wondering. The G7 foreign ministers, they're set to go to supper together at 7 o'clock. We haven't heard if Mélanie Joly is going to speak between now and then, and we haven't heard for sure if she's going to speak tomorrow. So we're looking for that communique. We're looking to see what the foreign ministers have kind of highlighted as their priorities and their concerns, but there's no sign of that either. So lots to come, or perhaps nothing to come in the next 24 hours.
That's like everything right now in the news cycle. I mean, look, the answer to the question of how she's going to make it work is probably a Challenger jet. Maybe that's what it would be, but maybe because of the seriousness of the issues that are on the table at that meeting, that's why it is so quiet. I mean, we'll have to see. Kate, thank you so much. You can go have fun now with the rest of your colleagues. That's the CBC's Kate McKenna at the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting in Quebec. Okay, we're standing by here to take you to a press conference in Washington, D.C. with Dominic LeBlanc, the Minister of Finance, and François-Philippe Champagne, as we understand it, the Minister of Innovation, and Ambassador Kirsten Hillman. They met with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick today. Also standing by is our Power Rankings panel. They're going to weigh in on all of today's developments, and our quote of the day, which we're going to give you now as we wait for the ministers to speak in D.C. This was the best meeting I've ever had coming down here. Who said that? Find out after this break. Welcome back to Power and Politics. We are standing by, waiting to take you live to Washington, D.C., where Dominic LeBlanc and Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne will be speaking to reporters. Whenever you see a bunch of flags in front of a microphone, you know something big has happened today. They met earlier today with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in Washington, D.C., along with Ontario Premier Doug Ford. And here's some of what Doug Ford said coming out of that meeting.
Thank you so much. We've had a very, very productive meeting, obviously a very long one, too. We know that we're very close partners for many, many years. We want to make sure we continue building on that relationship. We feel that the temperature is being lowered. We feel the temperature is being lowered. And we've also agreed that we're going to have another meeting next week. And I think it's going to be very productive as well. We want the best outcome for both countries. We're like a family, and sometimes there's tension between families, but that was an extremely productive meeting, and I just want to thank the Secretary for the opportunity to go in there and stay this long and communicate. We shared a tremendous amount of views back and forth, and I'm feeling very positive, and I just look forward to reaching out again next week. But this, I can honestly say, was the best meeting I've ever had coming down here.
Why do you say that? Why?
Well, because I feel and I keep saying we feel like the temperature's come down.
How so, though?
I'm not commenting on their behalf. We also know we're an extremely important trading partner, I'd say top tier in the world to the United States, and how we can continue working together to support each other. And I know it's still going to be moving forward, and we'll get there, but there's always be bumps in the road, but it was very, very productive.
Did you get any assurances?
I'm sorry.
It's still on, right?
I'm sorry.
Nothing has been stopped. There's still
No, but it was very, I don't call them the threats. We're having very productive conversations, and they turned out very, very well. And I just look forward to, again, continue communicating. Next week, we got a lot on the table back and forth, but it was very, very good, very civil, very going back and forth. So I just appreciate the opportunity, and I'm grateful that we're able to do this rather than going back and forth on tit for tat.
Premier, how do you take Commerce Secretary Lutnick?
Okay, that was Ontario Premier Doug Ford speaking earlier today, talking about his meeting. As we wait for the federal ministers and to get their take on that meeting, let's convene our own meeting with our Power Rankings panel. I'm joined by Rachel Siegel, a former Director of Policy in the Stephen Harper government and co-host of the Beyond a Ballot podcast. Zane Velji is a former strategist for the Alberta NDP, and here with me in the studio, Laura D'Angelo, a former advisor to soon-to-be former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. How weird is it to say that? Okay, let's get to it with our quote of the day. Today's quote is this: "This was the best meeting I've ever had coming down here." Laura, who do you think said that?
Wild guess. Premier Doug Ford.
All right, Rachel, it wasn't Howard Lutnick. Who do you think said that? We may have just scooped ourselves by playing that scrum, but you.
That kind of hyperbole, that was Doug Ford all the way.
Okay, Zane, 3 for 3, right?
3 for 3, but is he premier anymore? He's signing autographs in the street of D.C.
He is a global citizen
scribbling
now.
on anything anyone gives him now. Jesus Christ, yeah, it's Doug.
Okay, all right, we got a JC out of Zane. All right, let's play the clip of Doug Ford.
We shared a tremendous amount of views back and forth, and I'm feeling very positive, and I just look forward to reaching out again next week. But this, I can honestly say, was the best meeting I've ever had coming down here.
Okay, you're all very smart, and you all paid attention to the scrum we replayed right before your segment. That was Doug Ford. Laura, I did not have very high expectations for that, based on what the president said today and all the other things you saw on American cable networks. What do you make of this vibe shift from Doug Ford here today?
I mean, I hope it's more than just a vibe shift. It seems great, but also it's so thin on details. We haven't heard from any of the federal ministers who have gone down there. But you know, Doug Ford so far hasn't shied away from sharing his feelings with, you know, Ontario and Canada as it relates to this. So hopefully that is also continuing here.
Rachel, what do you take from this? I mean, it's we have not heard from the others. We don't know what the president is going to say, and that's really kind of the key barometer in all of this. But, you know, Doug Ford, more positive than he sounded in a long time.
Yeah, and I'm dying to hear what's going to come out of this meeting, having it been his best meeting ever. But I think, you know, Zane said it jokingly, but we really do have to recognize the gravity of this moment, that a premier was able to have this meeting and tagging along with him the federal minister. Usually it's the other way around. And even Secretary Lutnick said, you know, it's a premier, it's the equivalent of a governor going after the United States. And so when you think about that in the global sense and the world order diplomacy, Doug Ford has made a very large impact on this massive issue within Canada. And so it is funny to say, you know, he's Captain Canada and he's doing all these things, but take away the humor, and he really has opened the door for us during this meeting. This is a better meeting than the premiers when they all went down had while they were in Washington, D.C. So regardless of what they're about to announce that has come out, I think it's a win for Doug Ford either way.
Well, Zane, he played his trump card, right? He said, I will tax your electricity and make it expensive, and I'm willing to cut it off. And, you know, Trump definitely reacted to that. And, I mean, we'll see what comes out of it. They got a meeting coming next week. He referenced that in the scrum. We're hearing from our colleague Mike Crawley, who covers Queen's Park. This is an officials level meeting. So it's not Doug Ford and Howard Lutnick again, but if you can get this stuff to the officials level and off the TV screens and out of the scrums, you might make some progress.
Yeah, I mean, this is the stuff of legends in some ways, David. Like, you know, I'm not a big Doug Ford fan. I've become one over the last 2 weeks, mainly because he's representing our country at the national level. He's saying the right things. He's saying the right things, not just to Canadians, but to Americans, saying, I still love you. You're my friends. I don't want to do this. I mean, when you talk about the vibe shift of Doug Ford from where he was last week to where he is today, it's also because he's the guy who could read the vibe of the Trump administration. They kind of like, you know, as much as they're throwing up remarks and sharp elbows at him today, they also kind of respect him. He's kind of their flavor in some way. I'm not talking politically. I don't want to make that comparison at all because he's far from it. You know, very loyal and an incredible servant to this country. But Doug Ford just seems to get it. So it's funny that in some ways we wait on bated breath for a Doug Ford press conference to understand the future of our country. It's wild times.
No, it's like we're writing the ballad of Doug Ford, you know, sort of thing. And someone said to me, I don't know if he's a good premier, but he's good in a fight. And, you know, it's like male friendships are kind of built around that.
Not
that
the protagonist I would have cast, but it's the one we've been given, and it's the one that stepped up. Okay, I'm cheering for him.
Yeah, so anyway, we heard from Doug Ford earlier. We're waiting and stand by to hear from the ministers. There's issues there in the embassy. We'll figure out exactly what's going to happen. But Zane, let's get to your pick. You've got it down for us. What do you got?
I do. I'm going to start controversially, come in hot. I've got it down on the Stephen Guilbeault out of Environment Ministry pick. And I know, first of all, I know I don't have the full picture in terms of what the ministerships look like heading into tomorrow. I know this is the guy that sold and wears the carbon tax, and I know he's getting another position in cabinet. At the same time, I think this is a down simply because Stephen Guilbeault, A, is popular, and B, the environment and climate is still very important in Quebec. And this might be rich for an Albertan to be giving advice to Team Carney about Quebec, but I hope they know what they're doing because this guy, you know, does move vote, and he is able to move votes specifically on the environmental file. So stripping that away from him, despite not knowing the big picture, which I do not, I think is a big, risky gamble, which is why today I'm putting it as a down. I think what it does mean to me is that Jolie, as you folks have reported at the CBC, is keeping her role, and I very highly suspect that Champagne is probably keeping his role, if not adding to it, to ensure that Quebec vote-getting contingents that they need is very much in place for Team Carney heading into the upcoming election.
Yeah, Laura, Stephen Guilbeault does move votes, but sometimes in both directions, you know, depending on which part of the country you're in. Like, he became very toxic sort of in Atlantic Canada and certainly in Western Canada. He is moving out of this job, but Jean-Yves Duclos is out of cabinet, which means there's a Quebec lieutenant position available, which is maybe where Stephen Guilbeault could end up. And I've also heard he might end up in a biodiversity and oceans type role, so still related, but just not on carbon tax and those sorts of things. What are your thoughts here?
I mean, often Zain and I agree on this panel, so this is going to be one of those unusual times where we disagree. I think this isn't up. You know, I think one of the realities of what has been reported about this cabinet is that we are looking at a 15 to 20 person cabinet. That means that whomever is in it is going to have a big role. They're going to have profile, and they're going to have expanded mandates. So, like Zain, not knowing where Minister Guilbeault is about to end up, he's going to have an expanded mandate, and he is going to have profile. He is going to continue to move votes in Quebec. And especially when we look at, you know, Mark Carney needs some help because of his French. We know that. He needs support in Quebec. I don't expect to see Guilbeault have a small role. And I also think the other reason I have this as an up is, frankly, I think this is showing that Mark Carney is willing to make some pretty tough and potentially controversial choices when it comes to his cabinet. And that likely means, you know, as he moves forward and really makes big changes to what, you know, the government's done over the past few years, what's going to come forward?
Well, Rachel, Stephen Guilbeault moved off the carbon tax and supported Mark Carney. If he were to lose a cabinet position entirely after doing that, that'd be some rough trade. So he's probably going to have a role. Just what are your thoughts on the transition here?
Well, you know, it's interesting when you're looking at 15 people and you're keeping the guy that has said that the consumer carbon tax is sound policy, the guy who has said that he would resign from cabinet at one point if they got rid of the carbon tax. You know, Laura's right. These people are going to have bigger roles because there are so few of them. And in an election where we have seen that this was about the carbon tax and now we're shifting away from that, the Liberals are trying to put this to bed by saying the consumer carbon tax is out. It's interesting to see that Mark Carney, of the 15, the smaller cabinet would choose Guilbeault, who has been such a supporter of this tax and something that probably the Liberals would rather just not talk about going into the polls.
Yeah, they're going to have some sort of a climate policy that will include a price on pollution, a carbon tax of some sort, more industrial focus and big emitters, but not consumer facing. And we'll need to see exactly what that looks like. Okay, we're going to continue with the picks, but I got to warn you, I may have to cut you off. We're expecting Dominic LeBlanc and others to start scrumming in D.C. So don't take it personal. It's just we're in a trade war, and that's what we got to do. So, Rachel, let's go to you, and you've got it down. What do you got for us?
My down this week is Jagmeet Singh, because we have seen the Liberals and the Conservatives really repositioning based on Mark Carney's coming in. The Conservatives are trying to reframe the ballot question. Jagmeet Singh, to his credit, has come out a few times over the last few weeks and made calls for the House to come back. He opened a campaign office in British Columbia. Nothing really seems to be getting traction. And the person that seems to be benefiting from that is Mark Carney. When we look at the polls, some of those NDPers who are now going over to the Liberals. But for me, as a British Columbian, you know, we have strongholds, NDP strongholds in the urban centers in this province. And as the people who find out who won the election last in this country on election night, you know, it might be something that we're looking at on election night and wondering where those NDP strongholds will go, whether or not they will go Liberal, and whether or not that could change the outcome of the election ultimately.
Well, there's no more media blackouts, so you can watch from the minute the polls close in Newfoundland and Labrador.
Close later.
Yeah, I know, but you can watch.
A little bit of time.
I know. I know. Often it has been BC has been the empty net goal, you know, and I got a feeling it's going to be different in this election. Zain, the NDP find themselves in a very, very, very difficult spot.
Sure. Because
certainly in English Canada, it seems to be polarizing, liberal, conservative, and dealing with Trump. And Jagmeet Singh, this is his third crack at it. He's known, but he's not getting a lot of attention right now.
Well, especially if you compound the fact that he's not getting a lot of credit either for the big programs that he's been able to introduce or at least influence for the Liberals. And then especially if you let me keep compounding, if you compound the fact that they had the ability to call an election with Justin Trudeau, historically unpopular, still in office. It's no longer the case. But I mean, with all that being said, the NDP have something that no other party really does. It's kind of like that meme where they've got that red button that he can lift up and push, and that red button's labeled minority government. And in a minority situation, Jagmeet Singh could find himself, frankly, exactly back where he is, which is balance of power and still keeping his job. Am I trying to silver lining this? Yes, absolutely, because I still don't think the NDP have hit their floor in terms of what their vote share, both from a seat as well as national sort of horse race looks like. but there's always that last-minute ability to be the balance of power in a minority. That's the best advice I guess I have for the NDP at this junction.
So hope for status quo. Is that what you're saying, Zane? Is that sort of a situation?
hope for
Because he's not going to be able to do it with Pierre
maybe.
Poilievre, right?
Yeah.
He's not going to be able to do it with Pierre Poilievre. It would have to be with Carney or I don't
Agreed.
know, something like that, right?
For the clarification, that's right. That's right. Yes.
Laura, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, the New Democrats are, this is his third election. 19, 21, and now 25. What do you make of where they are at this point?
I mean, it really feels like Jagmeet Singh is always just a few steps behind whatever the Conservatives and the Liberals are going to do. The only time his news seems to break through is because he didn't manage to make a really great decision or take advantage, to Zane's point, of calling an election when he could. I think Rachel's right here. This could have a pretty profound impact on the election this year. And, I feel for New Democrats federally because it's probably feeling pretty grim right now. But as a Liberal, it's not looking bad.
No. I mean, you've had quite a good month.
It's been a good couple of weeks.
I think it's easy to say that. Look, we're told the ministers are imminent, so I'm going to press ahead, but I'm going to apologize, Laura, if we cut you off. Let's go. What do you got for us?
No problem. My up-to-date is very different. My up-to-date is the reinvigorated debate around what to do with 24 Sussex.
Right.
And yes, this feels like a silly thing to talk about, but we also are in this really unique moment of national unity. It is maybe the one good thing to come out of the trade war right now. And maybe there's finally a little bit of will and consensus around at least having the discussion around what should we do with 24 Sussex, especially, it is the G7 right now. We are a G7 nation without, a formal residence that is secure and has the right type of spaces to welcome dignitaries and other leaders here. And I think it actually is time to finally have the discussion about it.
Yeah, so Rachel's a story that I actually had this morning on our webpage that the Prime Minister on his way out the door is trying to start a process that would be multi-partisan, long-term, take it away and try to detoxify the thing. And just once and for all, let's give our future Prime Minister somewhere to live, somewhere to work, and somewhere that's secure. Sounds simple, is it? What do you think?
Oh, no. What are we on now, David? Year 8 of having this conversation? I mean, we're looking at almost $40 million in discussions around 24 Sussex. What we have to realize is that 24 Sussex, and a lot of Canadians don't realize this, is not like the White House. There's no official work that goes on at 24 Sussex. So the conversation that we're having is about the Prime Minister's personal residence that they will live in. Fine, we all love the history around it. We love that they host foreign dignitaries. Good. It's been 8 years. It's estimated $40 million. The Prime Minister has been talking about this since he came into office because he moved out to Rideau College. Enough is enough. Let's get a plan together instead of this committee that Justin Trudeau is proposing. And let's get this dealt with once and for all for taxpayers and for Canadians.
Well, Zane, I think there are 3 options. Either redo things at 24 Sussex, move deeper into Rockcliffe where it's easier to secure, or make upgrades to Rideau Cottage. And it would be a residence, but it would have office and work and event space. So it would be more like what you see in other countries rather than, hey, it's Prime Minister Stornoway, for example. It would be a little bit more than that. Sorry, Zane, got it. Dominic LeBlanc and Minister Champagne and Ambassador Kirsten Hillman. Speaking at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. Let's listen.
Good evening, Merci d'être là. Thank you for being here.
Avons eu plus tôt aujourd'hui
earlier today, we had a lengthy meeting, a major meeting with Secretary Lutnick, Secretary Green, and a number of other high-ranking officials of the U.S. administration. It was a very constructive discussion. We spent a lot of time understanding the U.S. process. Over the next few weeks, we had a better understanding of the process undertaken by President Trump then on Inauguration Day. And we talked about how it's much more constructive for Canada and the United States to work together. We reiterated Canada's position that the U.S. tariffs are unjustified and that Canada and the U.S. will be in better economic position if we work together. And we appreciated the conversation that followed. Obviously, this was a meeting that took place along with Premier Ford, but I think we all had discussions that benefited Canada.
We had a lengthy and frankly a big meeting. There were many people with Secretary Lutnick, Ambassador Greer, senior people from the Trade Representative's Office, from the Commerce Department. It was an opportunity for us to understand in a very concrete way the American process over the next few weeks, President Trump's America First trade policy, and the decisions that Secretary Lutnick and the President and Ambassador Greer will be considering over the next few weeks. Obviously, we reiterated the long-standing position of our government that the tariffs are unjustified, that we think it's much more constructive to build a strong North American economy by working together, by dealing with issues as important as China and other issues that frankly should be dealt with by economic partners working together, not in a context of applying tariffs to one another. So we agreed to maintain the dialogue. I speak to Secretary Lutnick in many cases a number of times a week. We exchange text messages. He seems to be working late at night and early in the morning. And we agreed to continue those conversations. Alors juste pour répéter, on s'est engagé à la fin.
At the end, we committed to continuing our discussions, and I speak to Secretary Lutnick several times a week. We exchange text messages, often late at night or early in the morning. It's a constructive and cordial dialogue, but of course, we will continue until the tariffs are removed. François-Philippe would like to add something, I imagine. Thank you for being here. I think Minister LeBlanc has given you a good summary of today's meeting. It was a very lengthy meeting, a good meeting, a constructive meeting, during which we had important discussions, and we had an opportunity to remind our U.S. neighbors of the impact of these tariffs on both sides of the border for families, for businesses, for industries that are affected by the tariffs. I think there's a mutual understanding that there is an impact on both sides of the border. There cannot be tariffs without impacts and consequences. And it also was an opportunity to defend Canadian interests of the various industries that we referred to today, and to commit, as Minister LeBlanc said, to an ongoing dialogue, because this is through dialogue that we can move forward the issues, and I think that's crucial. Today's meeting was a very good meeting, and there will be others to advance Canada's interests. And I really think that with Premier Ford and the Ambassador and Minister LeBlanc, I really think that we took a step forward in terms of understanding our U.S. friends and moving forward so that we can make North America the most competitive market in the world.
A fairly lengthy discussion, a long discussion, a constructive discussion with our American partners, a lot of people around the table. We were in a position to restate the fact that these tariffs are having an impact on both sides of the border, in communities, for workers, for families, and also to make sure that our friends understand that this is harmful on both sides of the border. We made sure that they understand that we're here to defend Canadian interests, that there's potential for a reset as well, where you have now a new Prime Minister that is going to be sworn in tomorrow, to make sure that we engage constructively, that we engage in respect, and that we make sure that we look at the opportunities for us to do more together. Because at the end of the day, this is about making North America more competitive, more prosperous, and more resilient. So we'll be happy to take your questions.
We'll now go to questions. Spirit of getting to as many questions as possible. One question, one follow-up. Please state your name and the name of your outlet before starting. We'll go to Katie Simpson.
You just stated her name. You didn't. That's Katie.
Yeah.
I knew that was Katie Simpson. I've seen you on TV.
Katie Simpson, CBC.
Yeah.
I don't know if this goes to Minister Champagne or Minister LeBlanc. Does anything tangibly change as a result of this meeting?
Well, let me start, and I'm sure Dominic would say, a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue to make sure that we understand the impact on both sides of the border, that we make sure that we see that there is a different way forward that we can engage with to make sure that North America is more competitive. We talked about issues around economic security and national security. So I would say every time that we have the opportunity to come here in Washington and talk with the administration and the officials about our joint endeavor to make sure that North America is more competitive, that's a win for our country. But I'm happy to say if you want to add something.
Okay. So nothing changes?
Well,
There's nothing changeable, nothing's coming off, nothing additional is coming on from Canada's side. There's nothing tangible in this moment.
well, I would say the fact that we're engaging is a tangible outcome. We've said that we're going to be continuing that discussion. We talked about the impact on both sides. I would say, I think on their side, they understand the impact that these tariffs are having. We talked about a number of issues around economic security and making sure that North America would be more competitive. And also talking about, kind of a reset. Like I said, we have a new prime minister that's going to be sworn in tomorrow. I think that we insisted that they may take that opportunity to engage with the new prime minister in a different way, with respect, and certainly looking at opportunities that we can work together and make sure that, we changed, in my view, a bit the channel about looking at opportunities and competitiveness in North America.
Judy Trin, CTV News. Minister Champagne, you mentioned that you wanted to get a sense of the rules of engagement so you could win, so Canada could win. It is a trade war. Is it too optimistic to believe that you are going to get transparency in how the U.S. will want to engage when they also want to win and they also want to dominate us in terms of our sovereignty?
Well, we want to win, clearly. And I can tell you, when we know the rules of the game, we win. You just saw the hockey game recently. The thing is that what we came out today, we have a better understanding of the frame around the America First economic policy and trade policy they put together. That understanding, I think, is helpful. Obviously, those were private conversations, so we're not going to be standing here, Minister LeBlanc and I, with the ambassador to go into all the details of what we discussed. But I would say that we leave Washington, I think, better equipped in making sure that we can defend Canadian interests. You want to add anything?
Follow-up question. Cabinet shuffle tomorrow, as well as swearing in of our new Prime Minister. The Commerce Secretary has also been on record saying that he wants to deal with a government that will be able to make more long-lasting permanent changes. We know that Mark Carney wasn't here today. What is going to happen in terms of this government? How are you going to get to a position of more permanence so that Secretary Lutnick, so the Trump administration can say, we want to negotiate with you because you're going to lead Canada in the next few years?
Well, they understand that we're the government. They understand the democratic process in Canada. There's also an understanding that there'll be a discussion, I would think, in the coming days between the Prime Minister-designate and the President of the United States. They understand that despite the fact that we may be in an electoral process in the coming weeks, that this is priority number one for Minister LeBlanc and I. We will still be ministers during that period, or at least we'll see tomorrow. But certainly,
that was a mistake.
No, there's a good chance. And we will work together to make sure that we will defend Canadian interests despite the fact that we might be in an election. But we will be there. This is priority number one, fighting for Canadians every single day. This is what we've been done from day one, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Minister LeBlanc, would you like to? I noticed that Minister Champagne is taking a lot of questions. Is he going to get an expanded role?
I was born at night, but it wasn't last night. So you're not going to have me talk about a cabinet swearing in. I know it's very exciting. It's probably 16 hours from now. Your colleagues, I'm sure, will be at Rita Hall. I think they have to be there like at 9:30. The ceremony, I'm told, is at 11. So the good news is you'll have all those answers tomorrow morning. So you must be very excited about it. I certainly know we are. Azeb.
Oui, bonjour.
Bonjour. Azeb était à Moncton pour longtemps, là.
Oui, pendant 3 ans.
Ouais.
Alors, Azeb Oueddegorgis, Radio-Canada. Premièrement, on voulait savoir qui est
First of all,
l'interlocuteur du Canada.
I would like to know who is Canada's interlocutor and how the meeting went between Howard Lutnick and Doug Ford.
Qui n'était pas très content de ce qui s'était
Obviously, the
passé.
U.S.
Comment
was
s'est
not
passé
very
la
happy
réunion
about what had been done. So how did that meeting go between Doug Ford and Howard Lutnick?
François-Philippe ou l'ambassadeur
Well,
peut peut-être ajouter aussi.
my colleagues may wish to add something, but I can say that it was a meeting that Mr. Lutnick agreed to after his conversation with Premier Ford earlier this week.
Moi, j'ai parlé au Premier ministre Ford.
I spoke to Premier
la
Ford
même journée.
the same
Le
day,
Premier ministre Ford a dit que
and
ce serait
Premier
bien,
Ford said
si je pouvais
that it would be
l'accompagner à la-
great
à la
if I could
rencontre.
accompany him to
Ensuite,
that
j'ai parlé
meeting.
au secrétaire
After that,
Lutnick,
I
qui était
spoke
très
to
content,
Secretary Lutnick, and he
de
was
cette,
very pleased
de cette idée. Comme
with
vous savez,
that
c'est le
idea.
gouvernement
As you
fédéral qui
know,
négocie,
it's the federal
des
government that
traités de
negotiates
commerce international.
international treaties with other countries.
Cependant, les
However,
provinces sont des
the
partenaires
provinces
importants pour le
are
gouvernement
important
fédéral.
partners
On
for
a
the
une
federal
bonne
government.
tradition
We
dans
have
les
a
échanges
good
commerciaux de
tradition when
travailler
it
avec
comes
nos
to
partenaires
trade,
provinciaux.
which
Monsieur
means
Ford
that
est
we
le
work with
président
our
du
provincial
Conseil de la Fédération.
counterparts,
Alors, c'est
and
lui qui
Mr.
mène
Ford
un peu
is the chair of the Council of the
12
Federation,
autres
so
premiers ministres des
he
provinces et
is
des
in a way
territoires.
speaking for the other
Mais
provinces
c'était
and
une
territories.
discussion
But
tout à
this
fait
was a
cordiale avec le secrétaire Lutnick et l'ambassadeur Greer. On a tous offert des opinions. On a bien écouté les opinions du secrétaire Lutnick. Et on s'est entendu à la fin, Howard et moi, qu'on allait continuer la conversation la semaine prochaine. On est juste jeudi. Il se peut qu'on se parle avant la semaine prochaine. Moi, je suis très content qu'on ait un échange assez informel. Mais c'est une occasion aussi de réitérer, comme François-Philippe a bien dit, que nous ne sommes pas du tout d'accord avec l'imposition des tarifs douaniers de l'administration de M. Trump. Ce n'est pas une surprise pour M. Lutnick ou l'ambassadeur Greer. Et on va continuer de défendre les intérêts du Canada.
Une autre question sur la frontière, justement. Donald Trump parle toujours du 51e État. Howard Lutnick a dit que ça serait fantastique si les deux économies étaient intégrées. Il soulève tout le temps cette question. C'est peut-être pour ça qu'ils essayent de forcer les tarifs et rendre vraiment très difficile pour le Canada économiquement parlant. Est-ce que vous avez discuté de ça, justement, d'intégrer les deux économies? Est-ce que Howard Lutnick soulève cette question-là dans vos conversations?
On n'a pas, François-Philippe veut peut-être ajouter, on n'a pas discuté évidemment l'intégration des deux économies. Le Canada est un pays souverain, indépendant, fier. On devra être le partenaire économique et en termes de sécurité nationale le plus important pour les États-Unis. On a toujours été. On souhaite demeurer ce partenaire-là. Évidemment, ça ne va pas dans la bonne direction si on est en train d'appliquer des tarifs douaniers. Le Canada contre les États-Unis, parce que les États-Unis ont débuté ça avec le Canada. Ce n'est pas très constructif. Moi, j'ai partagé l'expression du Nouveau-Brunswick avec le secrétaire Lutnick. C'est une course au sous-sol. Il n'y a pas de prix pour celui qui arrive au sous-sol le premier.
Mais vous sentez la pression quand même?
La pression de
l'administration Trump?
On sent la pression économique. On va défendre l'intérêt économique du Canada. Mais l'idée du 51e État est une idée qui ne fait aucun bon sens. On a été très clair là.
First state is not on. Now, we're not going to talk about that sort of thing at a business meeting with an American Secretary of Commerce. We're there to talk about economic issues. François-Philippe. Well, I think that what you're seeing increasingly, and Mr. LeBlanc is absolutely right. Now, this meeting really allowed us to be very clear about the economic security of both countries being tied together. I won't enter into the details of the discussion, but for example, we talked about Canadian aluminum and how it helps the U.S. defense industry, the aerospace industry, how Canadian steel can help the U.S. You heard the president recently talking about building ships, and we want to be part of that major vision to make North America more competitive. Now, I was there when the president talked about the golden age of America. And what we talked about at the meeting was, you know, if you look at trade relations through the prism of national security, Canada will be the choice ally. Canada has always been there. Canada is there now, and it will always be there. So, yes, there is an understanding, and that was our goal today, really, to talk about the integration of our supply chains, the integration when it comes to manufacturing in key manufacturing sectors. So I think that a session such as this that lasted more than an hour, I guess, well over an hour, I mean, that's very positive, because when I look at the other side of the table and people are saying, yes, you're right. For example, titanium, which is very important to the U.S. industry. We could talk about semiconductors. There are a number of sectors like that in Canada. And when you look at this, you know, there's the planet, but there's also that economic reality that Canada and the United States are really economically integrated in terms of our supply chains and have been for decades. So if we're talking about national security, Canada must be a choice partner.
For lack of a better term, what the vibe was like in the room today. And the reason why I ask that is because, you know, to kind of set the table, Secretary Lutnick goes on TV this morning, uses very aggressive language, kind of kills the idea that there was this olive branch. How much of that was grandstanding versus kind of having a relatively normal diplomatic meeting, considering there were just so many people in the room? Did he repeat the kind of same language in the room, or was it actually much more civil?
I would say I've been Minister of Foreign Affairs before. I have had a number, like Dominic and the ambassador, a number of engagement with foreign leaders around the world. I would say this was a constructive discussion. We have our disagreements, but as long as you have dialogue, you're making progress. That's how I see it. Obviously, they understand our position. We understand their position, but there's a dialogue. The fact that we were able to be here today with the ambassador, with Minister LeBlanc, with Premier Ford, state our case, make sure that they understand a number of things, for us also to listen. I would say, you know, engagement and dialogue is certainly the way forward. So that's how I would characterize, but I don't know if Dominic, you want to add to that?
No, it was an excellent answer.
And last question is, something that's starting kind of to drip out there is this idea that, you know, Canada should be more like Mexico. And all week I've been meeting with Republican leaders, and they keep saying, you know, like maybe you just need to tone it down a bit and, you know, let him feel like he should win. You know, what gives you the conviction that the strategy Canada's taken is the right one in terms of kind of being blunt and using economic leverage against the U.S.?
Well, I'll just say something and I'll turn over to Minister LeBlanc if he wants, but I think there's no alternative than standing up for Canadians, standing up for our workers, and standing up for our industry. I think if there's one thing that President Trump respects is strength, is frankness, is people who defend their own interests. That's what we came in this town for, and that's what we will continue to do. And I think meetings like the one we have today, and there'll be more, as Minister LeBlanc said, every time that you have engagement, dialogue, but also that you can voice your differences, I think it brings the discussion forward. So I would say if I put that, we do it our own Canadian way. The Prime Minister designate also has been outspoken about that. We'll be talking about the economy. We're going to be talking with respect to each other. We're going to be talking about competitiveness and the important role that Canada plays not only in North America, but in the world economy.
Thank you.
I think we've got time for 2 more.
Kelly Malone, the Canadian Press. So Trump's team has been on the news talking about how Canada doesn't really have a prime minister. Do you get any indication that they'll be willing to work with Mark Carney after tomorrow? Or are you expecting more fulsome conversations won't happen until after the Canadian election?
Well, I can, you know, I am fairly confident that they will want to be on our side. We are certainly willing to engage with the President of the United States. You know, Mr. Carney will be sworn in tomorrow as the Prime Minister of Canada, and I think it is a good thing that these two leaders will be able to talk. I think today was a good meeting, obviously, to exchange views, and I think there's a desire, I would say certainly on our side, but probably on both sides, to have the two leaders talk to each other. They've met each other before, that I can say, because having spoken to Mr. Carney, they have in the past have had interactions, or they have met. And you know, Mr. Carney brings an outstanding level of experience and resume, understands the world, understands markets, understands the economy. And I think in that sense, this is kind of the kind of discourse that I would think that the president would be willing to engage with, someone who will talk about the economy, how we can be competitive, and how Canada can be a partner for growth in North America.
Anything?
But I want to be very pleasant here, but I don't accept the premise of the question. Canada always has a prime minister. Canada has a prime minister today. Tomorrow, Canada will have a new prime minister. But there's always a prime minister in office. The government retains the authorities, for example, to impose counter tariffs. Even during an election period, the government will be in a position to respond if we decide to respond. So I think we have to be careful. And in my casual conversations with Howard Lutnick or even Secretary Bessent, they would ask me, like, tell me, like, this process, like what happens over the next few weeks. So there's no confusion on their part in terms of how Canadian democracy will unfold. Canada will always have a government that is in a position to exercise its authority, and it's no different today. And tomorrow it'll be a different government that will be exercising that same authority and defending Canadian interests.
I will clarify, Trump's team said it, not me.
No.
So Jamieson Greer was working with Bob Lighthizer in the negotiations of CUSMA in the first Trump administration. So what did he say to you about the trade pact's future? And can you really have any true conversations about CUSMA with these tariffs hanging over Canada that change daily?
So maybe the ambassador would want to add something, because she's worked with Ambassador Greer before. We met him when we came down a few weeks ago and had a meeting at the White House. I thought he was very thoughtful. He was very constructive. He clearly has a lot of experience in these issues. We agreed with him and Secretary Lutnick that the details of the conversation are most effective when they're kept private. But we also agreed to continue the conversation. And I think that the conversations will benefit from his experience and his expertise in this area. And I do agree with the idea that if and when there is a discussion to review a free trade agreement, it's not particularly helpful if there are a series of tariffs applied to the Canadian economy, counter tariffs, which are no surprise to anyone. We've been saying that for many weeks, would be the position of the Government of Canada. If we think that the best way to have an effective conversation is to go back to respecting the free trade agreement that Mr. Trump negotiated in his first term, and if they want to have a structured, constructive discussion about elements of that agreement that they want to improve, of course, the Government of Canada will be ready to have those conversations. Kirsten, did you want to add something?
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that he is, as the minister says, a very experienced trade expert and negotiator. And I think that the administration's, if you look at their America First trade policy, it has many elements to it. And he is the main quarterback of those series of studies that are happening. I think that that is primarily what they're looking at now to get to the deadline that the president has set for coming out with the recommendations from all of those various studies. And he, you know, he said as much to us about that today. And then the review of the USMCA or the CUSMA, it comes in 2026. So there is a timing issue here that I think the administration is looking at, and April 2nd is certainly the next date that they're focusing on.
Time for one more question and follow-up.
Reggie Cicchini, Global News. You say you're taking concrete steps to have conversations with the Trump administration. Is it helpful to have provincial leaders taking such a vocal and visual role in these conversations as well, zeroing in on the threat for potential Ontario tariffs, paused or not right now, on energy exports? I mean, it caused friction with the White House, but obviously it also led to a face-to-face. So is it helpful to have provincial counterparts taking part in this as well?
So I'm also the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. I talk to premiers across the country quite regularly. Obviously, Premier Ford, in his capacity as chair of the Council of the Federation, has a leadership role in that context as well. I speak to Premier Smith. I speak to Premier Moe. I obviously want to speak to the Premier of New Brunswick often. The Premier Legault. These are ongoing conversations. We believe that the country is stronger when the provinces work together and with the Government of Canada. We've been very grateful for the unity that Canadians have shown, but that's also reflected by all the orders of government in these conversations. We wouldn't presume to tell Premier Ford how to manage issues within the jurisdiction of the Government of Ontario. In our federation, the provinces are sovereign in their own jurisdiction. The Government of Canada, however, is responsible for negotiating international treaties and trade agreements. But the tradition is that the provinces are consulted and are involved with the Government of Canada in ensuring that we're representing the national interest. So that was part of the conversation today, which I thought was quite constructive.
I'll give my follow to Mr. Wingrove.
Oh, not to Josh. Oh, no.
Josh.
No, sorry. Wow, that's not.
We really snuck in there.
That's really gross. You kept telling everybody to go ahead of you, Josh.
I know. Thank you for this. Can I ask you a couple of things on, number one, the President has been talking a lot about dairy. Is Canada open to changes to that system in the context of a broader trade negotiation? And secondly, a lot of the talks in the last week has been focused on Premier Ford's export tariff. There's been talk also of other measures the federal government could take on export controls or tariffs. Are those still on the table, in particular, on oil or potash?
So it was like 5 questions, I think.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Again, provinces within their own jurisdiction will come to the decisions that they do. We have been encouraged by so many provincial and territorial governments looking at ways, in some cases non-tariff measures, that will impress upon the American administration that this is not a constructive way to build a strong North American economy. So the Premier of Nova Scotia decides to increase the tolls on American trucks on a part of the Trans-Canada Highway between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Every province has come up with ideas that they think will show Americans that this is not a constructive way to continue. With respect to dairy, we've been clear from the beginning that there is no discussion about reopening the agreement that was reached in the CUSMA context 8 years ago now on dairy. We did not discuss that today. We've been clear publicly and in private that that's not on the table, and we don't intend to have that conversation.
Is it fair to say all countermeasures right now are paused as these talks continue?
So I'm sorry, in your 5 or 6 questions, Josh, you did ask about export taxes. Again,
or controls?
Export controls, export permits would be another. We've said all these options remain on the table. Our hope is we don't get to the point that we're examining these sort of extraordinary steps. We've been clear that if on April 2nd we haven't arrived at a circumstance where these tariffs are lifted, Canada would take further retaliatory measures on that sort of total of $155 billion of imports into Canada, on which we would apply a 25% tariff. That's not a surprise. I've discussed that with Secretary Lutnick. So we continue to believe the best scenario is to remove these tariffs and remove all of these ripostes, these retaliatory measures. But if we get to a circumstance where it's in the interest of the Canadian economy to continue to impress upon the Americans that this is not a constructive way to build a prosperous economy on both sides of the border, it won't surprise anyone that we'll put those in place. And all the options remain on the table as we go forward. But our hope is that we can get to a position where we don't get to a circumstance where we have to use them, but they remain on the table.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Merci.
Merci. You were watching CBC News Network, and we were all watching live Dominic LeBlanc, François-Philippe Champagne, and Ambassador Kirsten Hillman as they were speaking about their meeting with U.S. officials, including the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and being very careful in the tone that they strike. So what did all of that mean? Well, let's bring in our chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, and Richard Madden. Richard is in Washington, Rosemary in Ottawa. And let me ask both of you, and I'll start with you, Rosie. What do you make of what you heard?
Listen, I think that everyone agrees that constructive conversation and dialogue is a good thing when it comes to how Canada is responding to the United States. It doesn't